These are four signs that you don't really trust God to provide for you. And I want you to pay close attention to sign number one, because this one will keep you stuck in less than what God has for you forever. And God showed me these four signs in myself, so I started seeing them everywhere. And what shocked me was this: the number one sign we're going to talk about, a lot of people actually think it pleases God, but when you really look at it, it does not please Him. It angers Him. So, saying that, let's get into it. So, you can stop thinking you trust God and actually start living like you do. Now, sign number four is you hoard. Hoarding is subtle. It kind of says God provided this time, but I don't know about next time. So you over accumulate just in case. But the root cause of this is not wisdom, it's fear. And we see this in Exodus 16. God told the children of Israel, gather what you need for today and do not store it overnight. But some of them did it anyway. And what happened? It bred worms, it stank, and Moses was angry. Why was he angry? Because their actions revealed their hearts. They did not trust God enough to obey him. Now, some of you may be thinking, but aren't we supposed to store up like the ant? And the answer is yes, but here's the difference. It's obedience versus fear. And in Exodus 16:22 through 24, God did tell them to gather double. And this time it didn't spoil. It didn't spoil because it was done in obedience and not fear. So I want you to hear me and hear me clearly. Storing out of obedience is wisdom, but storing out of fear is distrust. And what's built in fear often doesn't last anyway. Now, sign number three, you don't trust God to provide, is you don't rest when God tells you to. Exodus 16:26 says, 6 days you gather, but the seventh day is the Sabbath. Rest. What did they do? They still went out and tried to gather. Why did they do that? Because they did not trust that what God provided was enough. So they overworked. And I want to ask you, do you rest when God says rest, or are you afraid to slow down? Because you think if I stop, everything will fall apart, or if I stop, I won't make enough money fast enough. Psalm 127, 1 through 2 speaks to this, and it says, except the Lord build a house, they labor in vain. It's vain for you to rise up early and stay up late, for he gives his beloved sleep. Some of you are exhausted, and it's not because God asked you to do more, but because you don't trust him enough to stop. Now, sign number two that you don't trust God's provision is that you murmur and you complain when you are in transition. And this one sounds like this. It sounds like I should have stayed where I was. At least I knew what I had. At least I knew where my next meal was coming from. At least I knew where my next paycheck was coming from. It also sounds like this is way too hard. Listen to me. You left something God told you to leave, but now that you're in the in between, you're doubting him. We see this again in Exodus 16:2. The people, they were murmuring and complaining, and they said, why did God bring us out here to die? We should have stayed in Egypt. Now think about that. They prefer bondage with certainty over freedom with trust. And we do the same thing, because complaining is not about your situation, it's about your trust. And God responded by bringing bread from heaven. But even in the miracle, they still didn't trust, because the issue was never the provision, the issue was always the heart. Now, sign number one is that you go back to what's familiar. And this is a big one, because this is the one that will keep you away from what God has for you forever. Sign number one is that you go back to what's familiar instead of forward into what God promised. And this one hides and it disguises itself as being wise, as playing it safe, as being realistic. But if you look deeper, it is fear. It's I don't really trust God to provide for me out there. So you stay here where it's predictable, even if it's limiting, even if it's unhealthy, even if it's toxic, even if it's beneath what God has for you. And this angers God. In Exodus 17, they asked, is God with us or not? After everything he had done, Psalm 78 shows us the pattern. God provided, they doubted. God provided again, they doubted again. Verse 22 says, they believed not in God and trusted not in his salvation, even after water from a rock, even after bread from heaven, provision over and over again. They still ask, can God provide in this situation? And because of that, the word says they limited God, not because God was limited, but because their faith was. And that is the danger. Going back to what's familiar will keep you from what's promised. If you can see any of these in your life, stop. Stop doubting God. How many times does He have to provide before you believe He will do it again? Here's your assignment for this week. This is what I want you to do. I want you to practice what I call the Omer principle. In Exodus 16:32 through 36, God had them set aside a full Omer of manna, which was the bread he provided for them. He wanted them to save it, look at it forever, so that they and the generations after them would always remember his provision. It also points out in verse 36 that an Omer is a tenth of an ephah, which is a measure. To apply the Omer principle, I want you to set aside 10% of what God gives you, not out of obligation, but as a reminder that God is my source. And give it where God leads you. It could be someone in need, it could be a shelter, it could be a person going through hard times. This will build trust. Now, the second assignment is I want you to create an Omer journal. Write down every time God has provided for you, every miracle, every breakthrough, every moment he came through. Then read it and read it often because remembering builds faith. When you remember God's provision, you stop hoarding, you stop overworking, you stop complaining and running back to what's familiar, and you start living, finally living in trust and belief in God's provision for you. Now, if this message spoke to you, please like, share, and subscribe because this message needs to reach more people. And until next Sunday, walk in full trust in God's provision. And I'm Shelomith, and I'll see you next week.